So you want to play PC games at 4K, but you've done your budget all wrong. You've spent all your money on a fancy 4K display, but you've only got $40 left over for your graphics card. So I've decided to test a $40 GPU at 4K in 2024 just to see how well or how poorly it gets on, and if I'm honest, I'm kind of surprised. I can hear you screaming in the comments already. Why on earth are you doing this? It's an utter waste of your time. And to that I say, I basically did it for the laughs because I got this video idea while I was just bored one day and I was like, yeah, I may as well test a 980 Ti at 4K. Speaking of which, that's the GPU I'm using today. It's 2015's best gaming graphics card, and when Maxwell was a thing, 4K gaming really wasn't on the cards, especially on a single graphics card. But if you had 2 or 3 980 Ti's in SLI, you could probably get away with 4K gaming, but on a single card, it was not really that possible. It was mainly designed for full HD, absolutely maxed out gaming, and maybe even 1440p, as that did start to emerge around 9 years ago. But in the modern day, in 2024, 4K is certainly not on the cards for a GPU like this. And you might be asking, how on earth did I get a 980 Ti for just $40? Well, I found this one used for about 30 GBP, and it was apparently not working properly, but it works totally fine. You can see that in a video detailed up there. But without any more talking, to find out if this Maxwell beast from 9 years ago can play games at 4K in 2024, I've tested it at both native 4K and with FSR balanced as well, just to see if you can get a playable frame rate using newer technologies. All testing has been done in my testing PC, which has a Ryzen 5 7600, 32GB of 6000 MHz CL36 memory, a Western Digital SN770M 2TB NVMe SSD on an MSI X670E Tomahawk Wi-Fi motherboard. The latest NVIDIA driver has been used at the time of testing. I'll put it down there because I can never remember the numbers off the top of my head. But without any more talking, let's get into it. The first game up today is Cyberpunk 2077, and without the aid of FSR today at native 4K, it's a bit, well, the 980 Ti struggles quite a bit with just 24 FPS on average, and the 1% low trailing that by 4 frames per second. This would look good if it was a Hollywood blockbuster, but it's not. It's a video game, and 24 frames per second isn't playable. I don't care what you say. But luckily, this game supports FSR, and so does the 980 Ti. This ups the frame rate by 16 frames per second, and the 1% low is also looking much better as well. So yes, can you play Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K on a 980 Ti? Technically, you kind of can. You've just got to enable FSR on balanced, because yeah, you kind of need to. Doom Eternal on the medium preset doesn't require the aid of upscaling because 59 FPS on average with a 1% low of 45 frames per second is relatively playable performance in my opinion. I'd probably recommend sticking it to the low preset because the frame rate was jumping all over the place, so a low preset here would probably help out. Unluckily, Doom Eternal, to my knowledge, only includes DLSS upscaling. It doesn't have FSR, so you can't upscale on a 980 Ti, but you can still get some decently playable performance at 4K with this 9-year-old GPU. Spider-Man Remastered continues to show it's one of the most optimised AAA games because on the low preset, just getting above 40 frames per second on average with a 1% low only trailing that by 6 FPS is not terrible performance at all. Is it the most playable gameplay in the world? No, not necessarily. But if you were to enable FSR, you can expect 12 more frames per second on average, and the 1% low does tidy up quite a bit as well. So this is what I'd recommend. So FSR, once again, does kind of help out with the average frame rate, and the 1% lows for that matter. Hogwarts Legacy is up next, and it didn't even reach 30 frames per second on average, but hey, it was a lot more playable than Cyberpunk at native 4K. This just goes to show, even on the low preset, the 980 Ti or a GPU as old as this can't really game at 4K, but this is exactly what I was expecting. FSR does come in clutch massively in Hogwarts Legacy because it gets just south of 60 frames per second with that enabled, and the 1% low at 44 frames per second is not too bad in my opinion, but this is certainly a playable experience, and it still looks relatively sharp even with balanced FSR, so not a terrible gameplay experience in my book. So with all of the new AAA games out of the way, it's time to dial back the years to 2016 with Skyrim Special Edition. The GTX 980 Ti was only 1 year old when this sort of remastered definitive edition of Skyrim came out, and you can really tell because on the high preset, 60 FPS on average with a 1% low, trailing that by just 1 frame per second, means that the 980 Ti is giving a very nice, smooth and playable experience here. The reason why it's locked to 60 FPS is because the Bethesda engine on these games is not very good at all, and if you go past 60 frames per second, you do start to run into weird physics problems, so a capped 60 FPS is all you're going to get in a game like this. But where you won't be getting a capped 60 FPS experience is in Halo Master Chief Collection. Here I tested Halo Reach on Fi-Fi and the performance was pretty good with 140 frames per second on average and a 1% low of 92 frames per second, which is not too bad in my opinion. It felt nice and smooth on the enhanced preset, so it looks good. And it looks incredibly sharp at 4K as well. Albeit Halo Reach was a game that launched in 2010, so it's not exactly new, but it still looks pretty good at 4K. Rounding off our benchmarks today is Fortnite, and for obvious reasons here, I tested it at the Performance API as this should give us plenty of performance, and that it did, getting just over 170 FPS on average, with the 1% low trailing that by just over 50 frames per second means it's nice and smooth, especially for Fortnite, as this game does tend to stutter quite a bit, but I'd say this is very playable if you had a 144Hz 4K monitor, but then again, if you've got one of those, you probably don't have a 980 Ti. Regardless, performance in Fortnite is pretty good at 4K on the Performance API. If I'm being totally honest with you viewers, I'm absolutely surprised with how well the GTX 980 Ti gets on at 4K, even in newer AAA titles, even though it's certainly far from ideal. This is because with native 4K, you're basically locked to Hollywood film levels of performance. Like 24 frames per second in Cyberpunk isn't particularly playable, but it's nice if you're watching a movie, but you're not, you're playing a video game. Ironically, the saving grace to this Nvidia card is AMD. Thanks to the GTX 980 Ti supporting DirectX 12.0 at a feature level, this means FSR will work on it, and that's something we use today. I used it at the balanced preset as at 4K it still looks pretty sharp, not as sharp as native obviously, but it still looks pretty decent. And it did net us some pretty decent performance today. It lifted every game that was unplayable at native to a relatively decent frame rate with FSR enabled. Don't get me wrong, you're still going to be making compromises as you're enabling FSR, so it's not the best upscaling method, particularly on Nvidia, but it's GTX, you don't get DLSS, and you're still set to the low settings. The 6GB of VRAM today didn't allow for high textures at 4K, and you're set to low on everything else, so the lighting and the shadows don't look particularly great, which is probably not something you want at 4K if I'm honest. But I would wager if you're gaming at 4K, you're the type of gamer that doesn't like to make compromises, and they are certainly something we had to make today, particularly in the newer AAA games. This is why I recommend playing at 1080p with the GTX 980 Ti, as it's still pretty decent for it, and you can watch that in a video I made up there. But here you can enjoy better frame rates at 1080p, and you can also enjoy higher presets as well. But this is the great thing about PC gaming. You get to choose which resolution and which quality presets and which frame rate you play at, and this is why PC gaming is the best platform, in my opinion. Where you can make a case for using this graphics card at 4K is for older titles like Skyrim and Halo Master Chief Collection, which I tested today. Both of these games performed totally fine. Apart from Skyrim Special Edition, on the Ultra preset the 1% lows were all over the place, but on the high preset it wasn't that bad, and to be honest I couldn't really tell the difference between both these presets anyway, so I recommend the high preset there. And it just goes to show, if you're one for nostalgia like me, older games are going to be performing totally fine on older graphics cards like the 980 Ti. They're certainly not e-waste. Like I saw someone say an RTX 2070 was e-waste at one point. One of the worst takes I've ever seen. But I'm a big advocate of using old used hardware because it's still definitely got some value if you can play the games that you want to play. I'm getting a bit sidetracked here, but if you wanted to play older games at 4K, maybe you've got a 4K TV in your living room and you've got a GPU like the 980 Ti and you just want to sit back and play some old classics, certainly doable. But on the other hand, by no means am I recommending you to go out and buy a GTX 980 Ti to play games at 4K. Just because every game today was what I deem to be playable, it's still not a particularly brilliant graphics card for it. This is because it usually sells for around the same price as graphics cards like the GTX 1070, and this should have roughly the same amount of performance while consuming less power and having an extra 2 GB of VRAM. So if you wanted a budget retro 4K gaming graphics card, that's probably a better option for you, but the 980 Ti's got more aura, I suppose, because it used to be the highest end option. Also, the 980 Ti is getting on by quite a bit now. It's 9 years old and I'll be surprised if Nvidia doesn't drop game ready driver support this year. Albeit if you're playing older games, this will absolutely not affect you because game ready driver updates only affect new games and particularly games which are getting big updates. But what will affect you is the power consumption. It consumes a ton of power relative to its performance, so you will need to shell out on a very high-end power supply. I recommend a 650 watt. Actually, come to think of it, a 650 watt isn't that high end these days. And if you live in an area of the world where energy is quite expensive, you will feel it year on year because, yeah, it's consuming a lot of power. If the looming threat of Nvidia dropping driver support for this graphics card and its power consumption doesn't really affect you because energy is relatively cheap in your area of the world, I mean the GTX 980 Ti is actually pretty decent at playing older games at 4K. Obviously, new games, they're not going to be that good, and if you want to do ray tracing as well, you can forget about it. It's a GTX card after all. So to answer the question, can you play games at 4K on a $40 graphics card? And the answer to that is yes, mostly, maybe depending on your preferences. That is because you will be set to low and you will have to use FSR balance, which means you're technically not rendering at 4K, but it's sort of like a proof of concept, this video. You can actually play particularly older games at 4K and you can have a cinematic experience at 24 frames per second in Cyberpunk 2077 if you deem that acceptable for some reason. If you want to see how the 980 Ti gets on at a sensible resolution for it, there is a video right up there where it's tested at 1080p, and I'm going to leave this video here. I'll catch you in the next one.